Before I invite our Vice Chancellor to inaugurate the interdisciplinary lecture series, let me say a few words about Professor. She is a gold medalist from Aligarh Muslim University with a PhD in education from Kurukshetra University. She was selected as a Commonwealth Fellow for the University Administration course at the University of Warwick and Nottingham, and trained at the International Institute of Educational Planning, UNESCO Paris. Professor Akhtar was the Controller of Examinations and Admissions Director, Academic Programs at Aligarh Muslim University, and Founder Director, State Institute of Educational Management and Training, Uttar Pradesh. She has authored 2 books and contributed several book chapters and research papers. Madam has led international consultancy programs supported by Danida, UNFPA, UNICEF, including the prestigious NEPA Nepal project. She specializes in institution building, educational administration and management, distance education, education of minorities, and educational decentralization. I would now request our Vice Chancellor, Professor Najma Akhtar, to inaugurate the interdisciplinary lecture series of the Center for Jawaharlal Nehru Studies and give her welcome address. Professor Najma Akhtar, please.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, you are, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Dear students, ladies and gentlemen, good evening to all those who are in India, and good morning for participants from US, from where our illustrious speaker is going to address us. On behalf of the entire Jamia Millia Islamia fraternity, I welcome you all to the inaugural lecture of the newly initiated Interdisciplinary Lecture Series 2021 by the Center for Jawaharlal Nehru Studies, to be delivered today by Professor Akeel Bilgrami, Sydney Morgan Besser, Professor of Philosophy, Columbia University, USA, and that too on a very important topic, Indian secularism and art. This lecture series will invite eminent public intellectuals from India and abroad to give lectures to our students and teachers on contemporary issues which need to be discussed in the public domain on a wide range of interdisciplinary concerns. As you are all aware, due to the ongoing pandemic, we are unable to host any of our public lectures on our campus. But I am happy to announce that our centers and departments have been able to host a series of public lectures online, which have attracted a growing audience. It has been more than 100 in this last year. We have put these lectures on the YouTube, thus sharing with all. Let me tell you that this is Jamia Millia Islamia's 100th year of existence, our centenary year. And this is also Mahatma Gandhi's 150th birth anniversary. We are celebrating all these events in Jamia calendar with equal fervor and enthusiasm. Jamia has a special association with Mahatma Gandhi. It is well known and well recorded, and has come a long way and established itself as a prominent central university today. I'm happy to announce that we at Jamia have secured the first position among all the central universities in the country, according to the Ministry of Education ranking parameters, which have a score of 90% in 2020. All this has happened due to the continuous efforts of our students and our teachers and their pursuit for academic excellence. Our researchers are also working with great enthusiasm, and their papers and their publications are well referred. They are having good reference because their research is in the right area. In this connection, the recently announced National Education Policy is a welcome step in the right direction, with the desired focus on critical thinking, experiential learning, integrated pedagogy, and inclusive digital education. I can only say that my decades of old experience as a professor of education, I feel that the new education policy holds a lot of promise for the country. And in Jamia, we hope to focus holistically on the most critical tenets of access, equity, in infrastructure, governance, and learning in education. We in Jamia are looking not only at the quantitative expansion, but opening new and much sought after courses and most seats for students, but also quantitative improvement by way of empowering teachers with new updated syllabi and state-of-art teaching methodologies. The past 1 year, our teachers have been continuously striving to improve the e-content of their online courses. And COVID year, I must say, has taught us both the advantages and limitations of online teaching. Jamia has grown in a significant way. It has opened new centers of research and teaching. Thus, the university becomes a hub for the scholars of various disciplines. Through all our activities in Jamia's centenary year, Jamia academic community has paid its tribute to all the builders of modern Jamia. I'm happy that Professor Akeel Bilgrami, a professor from Columbia University, has readily agreed to deliver this inaugural lecture in the interdisciplinary lecture series hosted by the Center for Jawaharlal Nehru Studies. Professor Bilgrami is a professor of contemporary philosophy, but his main interests are the philosophy of the mind, philosophy of language, Gandhian philosophy, and of course, secularism, which is what he will speak on today. To my mind, he is the quintessential public intellectual with whom I'm glad this interdisciplinary lecture series have started today. The right beginning by the right person. I welcome you, Professor Bilgrami, to Jamia. You have come to Jamia campus before, and I am sure that you will come again in future when COVID time is over. But without waiting for that long, Jamia will continue communicated with you and with Columbia University. I also welcome the students and teachers of Jamia and all other participants from different parts of the country as well as the world who have joined to listen to Professor Bilgrami today. I welcome you all to today's lecture, and I close by congratulating Professor Rumki Basu and her colleagues from the Center for Jawaharlal Nehru Studies at Jamia for initiating a lecture series on important topics and securing and sharing them on the YouTube for students and faculty of the world. And in the end, a special congratulations to the organizers for selecting and inviting the most illustrious expert like Professor Bilgrami from Columbia to initiate the lecture series. It's the right beginning by the right person. I thank you and wish you all happy listening. Thank you very much.
Center for Jawaharlal Nehru Studies, we thank you very much for inaugurating this series of lectures. It's now my honor and privilege to introduce Professor Akeel Bilgrami to all of you today. Though Professor Bilgrami does not require any introduction to most of the distinguished audience here today, but I would be happy to introduce him to those who are not familiar with some or much of his work. Professor Bilgrami has been in the Department of Philosophy at Columbia University since 1985, and currently he is the Sidney Morgan Besser Professor of Philosophy and Professor Committee on Global Thought, Columbia University, USA. Akeel Bilgrami is a secularist and an atheist who advocates an understanding of the community-oriented dimension of religion. For Professor Bilgrami, spiritual yearnings are not only understandable, but also supremely human. He has argued in many essays that in our modern world, religion is not primarily a matter of belief and doctrine, but about the sense of community and shared values it provides in contexts where other forms of solidarity, such as maybe a strong labor movement, are missing. He has been on the humanities jury for the Infosys Prize from 2012, serving as jury chair from 2019. Akeel Bilgrami got a first degree in English literature from Bombay University. He went to Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar and got another bachelor's degree in philosophy, politics, and economics. He has a PhD from the University of Chicago after writing a dissertation, Meaning as Invariance, on the subject of the indeterminacy of translation and issues concerning realism and linguistic meaning. He has published a book in 1992 called Belief and Meaning from Black Belt, and another book was published in 2006 called Self-Knowledge and Resentment from the Harvard University Press. He is presently working on a book on the relations between value, agency, and practical reason. His book, Secularism, Identity and Enchantment, was published by the Harvard University Press in 2014. He is committed to publish two books in the near future, one called What is a Muslim from the Princeton University Press, and another on Gandhian philosophy, situating Gandhi's thought in 17th century dissent in England and Europe, and more broadly within the radical Enlightenment and the radical strand in the Romantic tradition from the Columbia University Press. He's also the editor of the books Democratic Culture, 2011, Who's Afraid of Academic Freedom with Jonathan Cole, 2014, Marx, Gandhi, and Modernity, 2014, and Beyond the Secular West, 2016. He teaches courses and seminars regularly in the Department on Philosophy of Mind and Language, as well as moral psychology, meta-ethics, and political philosophy. He also teaches seminars in the Committee on Global Thought, the Religion Department, and in political science, on politics and rationality, as well as on a range of issues, from questions of secularism and identity to the effects of globalization on politics and political thought. Professor Bilgrami was the chairman of the philosophy department from 1994 to 1998, the director of the Heyman Center for the Humanities at Columbia University from 2004 to 2011, and the director of the South Asian Institute from 2013 to 2016. I now invite Professor Akeel Bilgrami to deliver the first lecture in the Interdisciplinary Lecture Series 2021, hosted by the Center for Jawaharlal Nehru Studies on Indian Secularism and Art. Professor Bilgrami, please.
Very much. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm particularly glad to speak at Jamia because It's a chance to remember an old friend, distinguished historian Mushirul Hassan, who made Jamia the fine institution it is today. I'm going to speak about Indian secularism and art, partly because Indian secularism is in a crisis, as we all know, and partly because the crisis of Indian secularism began much earlier than its current manifestations of the last 6 years or so, 6 or 7 years, but in fact, it has been developing since the 1980s. And I want to focus on moments of crisis that surround art and literature and so on, starting first with Salman Rushdie's, the controversies around Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses, but more in detail about the attacks on M.F. Hussain by Hindutva forces. Now, before I speak about art, which I want to do for most of this lecture, I want to give you some very brief points about the nature of secularism and how it must be contrasted with two other doctrines or two other concepts. And I want to quickly define secularism because I think there's a lot of confusion about it. Many Indian academics think that secularism has a peculiarly Indian reformulation. I don't believe that. I believe Indian secularism is just the secularism that emerged in Europe. And so I want to make some definitional points right away for the first 10 or 15 minutes before beginning to talk about art. So the first thing I want to do is to distinguish between secularism and secularization. I've been doing this for some decades now, but it's not something that I can leave out because it's central to some of the analytical points I want to make. Secularism is quite distinct from secularization. Secularization is the name of a social and ideational process. It was first fully theorized by Max Weber, and it's a name for basically the loss of belief in God and religion and the myths of creation and so on, and a substantial decrease in the rituals and practices of religion, including dietary practices, church going, masjid going, temple going, and so on. So general decrease both in practice and in belief in populations at large. That's secularization. It emerged first in Europe, and it emerged as a result of the rise of modern science, but also because of the developments within the Protestant Reformation. Secularism is not the name of a social process. It is rather a very specific political doctrine which attempts to steer the influence of religion away from the institutions, laws, etc., that shape the polity of any given society. So it's a political doctrine. Secularism is a political doctrine, and this distinction is an obvious one to make. And though there's a lot of confusion when one sort of fails to keep it in mind, it's an obvious one to make because somebody can be not secularized at all. Somebody can be quite a devout religious person, practicing religion and believing in religious tenets, but still be secularist. still believe that the polity should be relatively free of the influence, of the direct influence of religion. And the same place can be completely secularist, but not secularized, such as the heartland of this country where I'm domiciled, the United States. So this is an obvious distinction. Now, sometimes the distinction can get muddied because the polity or a state can bring in political policies and principles on matters of religious practice. So, for instance, France's prejudices against the hijab were a way of entering into a field of religious practice in a way that amounts to an enforced secularization rather than secularism. And Atatürk's Turkey was also, I would say, not just secularism, but an enforced secularization. That is, forcing people to change their religious practices rather than in general political principles, such as, say, free speech. So if you make a distinction between matters of diet, matters of dress, etc., on the one hand, and principles, say, like free speech or gender justice, and counting the latter two as a matter of politics and the state, and the former as matters of culture. And I'm saying that secularism, by and large, restricts itself to not having laws and institutions be shaped and determined by religion, even though it allows for a great deal of freedom of religious practice. Okay, so if that's the distinction between secularization and secularism, there's a third doctrine that emerged, and it emerged much later in Europe. It emerged basically after the Second World War, and it's a doctrine that emerged because it was felt that secularism was not really addressing the particular grievances of minorities that had emerged or had arrived in European nations as a result of invited immigration to shore up a labor force that had been diminished as a result of loss of manpower in the Second World War. So migration from erstwhile colonies in many European nations came about as a result of these efforts to increase the labor force in European nations. And these minorities, facing racial hostility, wanted their minority cultural grievances to be addressed, and secularism was not doing it because secularism was opposed to all religions, whether majority or minority, having a role in politics. And so a doctrine called multiculturalism emerged, and this emerged basically in the 50s, late 60s and 70s, late 50s, 60s, and 70s in Europe, because it was felt that secularism was not speaking particularly to the demands of migrant community minorities in Europe. And multiculturalism is the idea that culture has a particular right to exist, and minority cultures should have, to some extent, their own laws to live by. And in a way, one way to think of multiculturalism is that there are no majorities. Every culture is a minority, including, say, Christianity in Europe. So every culture should be treated equally. And so it didn't have very much to do with keeping religion out of the polity, but rather having implemented secularism to then speak to the particular demands of minority religions as having a special autonomous status. So these are three different ideas: secularism, multiculturalism, which is a distinct doctrine, and secularization, which is not a doctrine about politics at all, but really just the name of a process of loss of belief and decrease in ritual and other everyday quotidian religious practices. So the question arises, what then is the definition of secularism? And I want to quickly just put down what I think is. So here's the idea. This is secularism, whether it's in India or anywhere. And I think it's a much clearer statement of it than the idea of separation of church and state or anything like that, because those are completely muddled and incoherent metaphors. But here's the idea. It's a relatively simple idea. I call it the lexicographical ordering definition of secularism, and it consists of three clauses, the definition. The first is the clause that there should be principles of a principle of allowing freedom of religious belief and practice. This is there in most liberal secular constitutions. A second clause is that there are principles, often enshrined in constitutions, that do not mention religion nor opposition to religion. Example, free speech, free expression, gender equality, etc. So these are just general principles, often in constitutions, and they don't mention religion, they don't mention opposition to religion. They just are completely general principles. So free speech is a standard example of it. Gender equality is another. Okay, so constitutions are often committed to a principle of freedom of religious belief and practice. They're committed to these general principles which don't mention religion or opposition to religion. And then the third clause in the definition is a meta principle, that is to say, that a principle about these two principles. And it says, if there's any clash between the deliverances of one, i.e., any particular practices or beliefs that are actually enacted or held, if there's any clash between them and the principles mentioned in 2, then 2 must be given lexicographical priority. Lexicographical priority is just a term in mathematics, which is sometimes applied in sociology and philosophy. But the idea is, if there's a clash between what happens when you grant religious belief and practices, if those practices and beliefs in any way clash with these other principles, such as, say, free speech, gender equality, etc., then these other principles mentioned in 2 must be given priority over 1. That's it. That's what secularism is. You don't have to say anything confusing and muddled. You don't have to create metaphors like separation, a wall of separation, or anything like that. This is what secularism was always. This is the secularism that emerged out of the Constituent Assembly debates in India. And it's the secularism that India adopted, though it made exceptions, which were temporary to Muslim personal law, etc. But by and large, this is what was adopted by India. Okay, so that's secularism. All right, so now so I've defined 3 terms, secularism, secularization, and I've said something about multiculturalism, which I'll come back to at the very end. Okay, so much for the broad introductory remarks. Now, in India, the crisis of secularism, one very spectacular manifestation of it, emerged, as we all know, when M.F. Hussain became the target of attack by these lethal emotional energies released by Hindutva forces in the Indian population. And Hussein's, some of Hussein's paintings, the Nude Saraswati and his painting Bharat Mata, became objects of attack. They became objects of lawsuits. He became an object of vilification. Some of his artwork was destroyed. Galleries and museums which displayed them were attacked, and departments of the study of art and art history which supported him were attacked, as in Baroda, and that was a very specific manifestation, a very specific casus belli, that those two paintings of Hussain in particular, those two artworks of Hussain in particular, were made the target. Now, the judiciary in India came to support both the High Court's and the Supreme Court's verdicts, supported Hussain against these attacks. You cannot expect that of the judiciary today. Times have changed since the time of Hussein's, the assessment of Hussein's alleged violation of constitutional principles. Now, in response to this attack on Hussain, a very wide range of supporters of Hussain declared that the field of art and the art world, by art world I mean the creative activities of artists, their products, the artworks, and the whole discourse of the study of art, whether it's done in art history departments or whether it's done in art reviews, in newspapers, periodicals, etc. This whole art world, it was said, in response to these attacks on Hussain, it was said, the art world is a secular space. And the question arises, what does that word secular mean? I have described and defined only secularism and secularization. But when the art world is described as a secular space, as it was done by almost everybody who supported Hussain, we have to ask the question, what is meant by the term secular as an adjective qualifying the art world in India, of modern art, the world of modern art? And it's not an easy thing to do. So what does the term secular mean? I've said what secularism is. I've said what secularization is. But what is it to be secular? Now, one obvious answer is that anything is secular which is outside of religion. So, since secularism emerged in Europe, one might say, for instance, that the merchant's overcoat is part of the secular world, as opposed to, say, the friar's tunic. But that can't be a resting point, because we don't want to just say that the merchant's overcoat is secular simply because it's part of the mondiality of the world at large and not part of the cloistered world of churches. What one means is, rather, that there are practices which are not, one shaped by religion or determined and controlled by religion. And two, they are practices which are not in the service of religion. So if the art world is secular, it is because its activities, whether of art production or art criticism or study of art, this is part of a set of practices which are not shaped and determined and controlled by religion, and they are not in the service of religion. What do I mean by not in the service of religion? Well, again, since it's a European idea, sticking to Europe, Bach's cantatas, or most of them, were basically sung in the greater glory of God. They were in the service of religion. Okay, so if the art world and its deliverances are not in the service of religion, that would be one way to describe them as secular. And they're not shaped by religion. Now, this still leaves it completely possible and open that the art world can engage with religion. But it is an engagement from the outside. It's not in the service of religion. And it's not shaped by religion. So there can be a whole lot of engagement, which is secular engagement with religion, but it's done from the outside. It's not in the service of religion, and it's not determined or controlled by religion. Okay, so that's one way, simple way to think of it. The word secular applied to the art world means that art is not in the service of religion and it's not determined and shaped by religion. It's obvious things to say. But now, having said that, our interest in art conceived of as a secular space is not just that it is outside in these two respects, but historically, we have a further layer of description to give to it, which is that it has come out from under the shadow of religion. It's not just something outside religion, but it has, no doubt, after the emergence of secularization, art has come out from under the shadow of religion. So, for instance, again, going back to a European example, since it started in Europe, Oxford University came out from under the shadow of religion. It was shaped and determined by religion for centuries. It was in the service of religion for centuries. It was essentially a cloister of learning. But over the centuries, it gradually emerged out of the shadow of religion. And today, for instance, it is not determined by religion, nor is it in the service of religion. So it meets the two criterion of being outside religion, but our interest in it is that it has come out from under its shadow. Now, if you take somebody like Lukács, when he spoke about the novel, Lukács said the novel is a literary form that is of a world that has been abandoned by God. Well, that's really, for a religious person, that's not a fair description because that's blaming the victim. In fact, the world abandoned God and not the other way around. But in any case, you get the point. Lukács' point was that the form of the novel is the novel form, the literary form is a secular form. He wrote basically more than half a book about this. And his idea, I mean, in a way, his idea is a simpler idea because, in fact, the novel emerged chronologically after secularization. So it isn't as if it came out from under the shadow of religion. It never was in the shadow of religion. as a novel form. Now, you can't say that about art. Art was deeply under the shadow of religion. It wasn't like the novel in that respect. So our interest in art being described as secular is that it came out from under the shadow of religion. And it's not just outside of the religion, but outside as a result of having come out of the shadow of religion. Okay, now, once you've laid this out, this very simple set of concepts and distinctions, once you've laid it out, and you look at what happened in India ever since the 40s and after independence, you get a sense that all these things, the points I've been making, which refer to distinctions between secular and religion and so on, they start off as distinctions, but they become encrusted into dichotomies, and they really become what theorists call binaries: religion, secular, and so on. And you can see how this happened. You can very much see how this happened when you get a sense from reading about the emergence of the Indian art world after independence. In fact, it started before independence, because when I was reading about this, I was looking at a whole range of progressive artists in Bengal as far back as 1943. But the famous artists who, on the national canvas, emerged because they felt that a new era had emerged, where there was a new prime minister, a new state. It was a state committed to a scientific outlook, a secularized outlook. It was a state committed to internationalism. And so a whole range of artists obviously found themselves susceptible to, keen to, be influenced and shaped by international centers of art, Paris, New York, and so a whole set of distinctions emerged between secular and religion, elite and popular, provincial and cosmopolitan, metropolitan and vernacular, traditional and modern, obviously. All these began to be very easily, these distinctions began easily to be applied to the discussion of art. And in a sense, you could see how this was not just a matter of terminology, but there was a real sense in which there was a claim that a whole discourse had emerged, which was trying to get past the sort of romanticist moorings of art, very influential art in Bengal, for this more international form of claim to modernity in art, and as a result, there was I mean, the way I think of it is, it was a little bit like Voltaire's Republic of Art, of Republic of Letters, in the Indian art scene, art world. That is, you find what Voltaire called a Republic of Letters was that there was a lettered class, a cultivated literary class, which circulated in salons, in classrooms, in salons, but in coffee houses, and in poetry readings, in discussions of literature, and in Voltaire's Republic of Letters, the capitals, I suppose, were Paris and Geneva, but it extended to St. Petersburg. Similar things were happening. A critical discourse had been created in India around modern art. There were galleries and museums exhibiting it. There was a discourse of criticism that emerged around it. There was discussion in coffee houses and cafes. And like Paris, Geneva, extending to St. Petersburg, you had Bombay and Delhi extending to Baroda and the famous art department there. So there was, in a way, a kind of Republic of Art emerging with this new ethos that had come since independence. And as this developed and these binaries emerged between religious and secular, secular began to be a description, an adjectival qualifier of the art world. And then there was a reaction to it as well. A number of artists began to say, Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh is the one who says it most clearly and explicitly that the whole Nehruvian ethos was a kind of subtle authoritarian secularization, and he declared that it had quarantined the secular, that's a phrase of Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh, and that it was time for artists to start making references and engaging in a non-sectarian way with religion again, and he tried to do this in some of his artwork, but it was a general reaction. So an engagement with religion was intended as part of the complication of the secular as applying to the art world. And this was even extended. I mean, if you look at some of Geeta Kapoor's work, she actually describes how these binaries had been crippling in a way, and it's quite possible that folk art and tribal art and so on could even usurp, she says, the avant-garde. And in fact, she appeals to some of my work on Gandhian enchantment to describe the possibilities of some of this muddying of distinctions, and all sorts of poster art and agitprop art, and even the catwalk in some of Ivan Sundaram's work. All these were part of efforts of the avant-garde to undermine these distinctions. And this is bound to happen in any field, except perhaps natural science. There are distinctions which emerge, they get encrusted into binaries, and then people react to it and try and complicate things, redefine things, make things more ecumenical. And why should art and the discourse around art be any exception to this general tendency of developing binaries and then undermining them through greater ecumenism and so on. But the interesting thing is that Ghulam Sheikh wanted to do all this, and so did many of the other artists. Some of them have been studied by scholars. They wanted to nevertheless do it in a non-sectarian way. But the Hindutva forces that eventually went on to attack Hussein were determined to do the same thing, attack the Nehruvian ethos for being too elitist, too narrowly secular, and so on, denying our traditions, etc. But they did it along sectarian lines. That was the big difference. Okay, so now if we ask the question, what is it that how should we think of the attack on Hussein, given this entire background? When art historians and art critics and the general lettered classes began to support Hussein by claiming that this was a secular form in the modern period. Modern art, modern Indian art was part of a secular art world. This claim for the word secular began to have a new meaning when it came in defense of Hussein. And that new meaning was that to call modern art and the art world in which Hussein was practicing his art, his exercising his talents, to call it secular was in fact to see it as a protected and safe space against these attacks. So it was, the word secular began to have the connotation when it came in defense of Hussein, that it's a protected and safe space against attacks of this, sectarian attacks of this kind. Now, I believe myself, all my instincts about this, I mean, this is a complicated issue, but all my instincts are that this cannot be the right way to defend him, to declare it to be a protected space against such attacks. And I believe that you can't do this, or you shouldn't do this, partly because the kind of protection that is sought inevitably deteriorates into a guild mentality. That is, it is to be protected because we are the lettered, we are the knowledgeable, we have been acculturated into the discourse of modernity and modern art. And therefore, the attacks on it are unlettered. They're outside of the coterie of knowledge, of the knowledgeability that constitutes the art world. And I think the danger of this is that you necessarily equate, as a consequence of taking this view of the secular, you necessarily equate the intolerant with vulgarity, of the failure to be acculturated and knowledgeable in the practices and the knowledges, the whole cognitive surround of modern art. And once you equate the intolerance of Hindutva with vulgarity, you've restored all the binaries that Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh and others were trying to undermine. Right? You're back to elite versus popular, secular versus religion, and so on. So I don't believe that that use of the word secular to defend Hussein can't be the right. A second instinct I have is against this use of the word secular. A second instinct I have against it is that a question arises: why is it that art needs to be protected from, why is the particular threat to the art world that comes from sectarian religion being singled out? I mean, there are threats to the art world that come from many different directions. Commodification, planned obsolescence, the debasements of celebrity, careerist corruption. I mean, you just look at Frederick Jameson's book, Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, and you'll find just a roll call of threats to the art world coming from late capitalism. A very wide range of factors in late capitalism. So why is religion being singled out? You have to say something specific about that in particular. And I don't believe you can answer that question without giving up on the idea of art as a safe and protected space against these attacks. You have to just fall back on secularism. You have to fall back on the idea that what we have is nothing but we have no resource to defend Hussein, but to fall back on the Constitution's commitment to what I call the lexicographical priority. That is, you must see Hussein simply as being protected by the fact that principle 2 is to be given priority over principle 1 when there's a clash. Free speech, free expression is part of principle 2. It's not that it's a secular space, which particular, but it's a general constitutional principle. So I think secularism is the only defense. It's not, you should not introduce the term secular as a protected space. There's nothing protected about it in particular, art in particular. It's just part of it, all expression. And in fact, Justice Cowell, in his High Court decision, which defended Hussein, is very schizophrenic on this. On the one hand, he talks of the art world as protected and a special safe space and so on, you know, but he also just says that art is a tool of expression. And there he seems to be suggesting that it's a general question of expression. There's nothing particular about the art world's secularity. Okay, now, so those are my instincts. I mean, I just don't think that calling the world of modern Indian art secular should be taken in that direction. One should just fall back on secularism. Okay, but now, if you fall back on secularism and you make the claim that it's protected under the general clause of free expression, Hussein is protected under the general clause of free expression, we now know that all those general clauses of free expression, like any constitutional principle, basically like any law, has built-in exceptions. So the built-in exceptions are always what John Stuart Mill called the harm principle. That is, you have a law, you have a constitutional principle, and of, say, free expression, but there are certain exceptions built into it. And those exceptions are if it causes one or other form of harm when you exercise free speech, say. Just like the laws of homicide have built-in exceptions, right? Self-defense is a built-in exception to homicide, to laws prohibiting homicide. So also, the principle of free expression, which is number 2 in my lexicographical ordering definition, has exceptions. And the Indian Constitution has a whole history of developing, refining the exceptions to free speech. And of course, one of the expressions is the one that really was relevant to Hussein, was the distress and hurt that his paintings are allegedly said to have caused in Hindus. Now, if that is seen to be part of the exception, we know that this is a very familiar problem, a very familiar issue of people feeling hurt, their sentiments feeling violated or hurt as a result of the production of novels like Salman Rushdie's. And now, Justice Cole dismissed these claims to hurt. But I want to talk a little bit about the very idea of being hurt. You know, T.S. Eliot once said of romantic poetry that its emotions do not have an objective correlative. What he means is that there's something irrational about a lot of romanticist poetical expression of distress and emotion of various kinds. That is, there's no grounding in something real for the emotion. That was much of his dismissal of romanticist poetry, by contrast with a lot of what he called metaphysical poetry of an earlier period, Donne, Herbert, and so on. So the point can't just be that people are hurt. If Eliot and others are right, you've got to, since a lot of hurt can be irrational, right? There's no objective ground for being hurt. A lot of hurt can be pretended. Right? Just think of physical hurt in the football field, in the soccer field. People just, you know, falling over, rolling over, pretending to be in pain, etc. Right? So there can be a lot of pretense about emotional hurt as well. There can be a lot of irrationality. So the question arises when you're considering cases like Hussein, Salman Rushdie, etc. When is hurt rational? When is it justified? When is it well grounded in an objective correlative? It's a standard issue to be raised. And we know that Justice Cole dismissed it. But I want to come back to this because I believe that some of these issues are very differentially relevant in the case of Hussein and Rushdie. It's just, I think we respond very differently to Hussein than what we did to Rushdie, and that needs diagnosis. I want to turn, I'll come back to that, but I want to turn now to look at another section of law, which is section 298 of the Constitution, and look not from the point of view of the so-called victims, the Hindu population that claim to be hurt, but from the point of view of the perpetrator. So section 298 demands what was the perpetrator, alleged perpetrator, Hussein, what did he do exactly? Or from his point of view, what was he doing when he painted the nude Saraswati or the Bharat Mata? Now, here's an interesting thing. Here again, the Supreme Court and the High Court verdict supported Hussein in saying that he did not intend to cause hurt or anything. But I want to step back and ask a general question. You know, two major thinkers and writers, Walter Benjamin and a great literary theorist and critic, Erich Auerbach, who wrote the book Mimesis, they both have said that ancient Greek epics and tragedy had heroes who had no inner life. What did they mean? They meant that Homer, say, or the Greek tragedians, playwrights, didn't really, there was an enormous amount of action. There was an enormous amount of very subtle interplay of characters, but there wasn't any detailed focus on the inner life of the characters, the inner mental life of the characters. Now, this is completely of a piece with criminal law in the ancient period, in Europe and Greece. Criminal law in the ancient period had absolutely no inner life that was made relevant to its jurisdictions. All you looked at was the action and whether or not, this is their term, it polluted the society, which was the thing to be assessed in assessing crime, criminal law. So it was a matter of strict liability. If you polluted the society with your actions, you were guilty. So, for instance, in Oedipus, we know that Oedipus had sexual relations with Jocasta. But we want to say that Oedipus did not have sexual relations with his mother. Why? Because his inner life did not conceive of his sexual relations as being with his mother. Unless you get to his inner life, you can't say he didn't have sexual relations with his mother. From the point of view of the outer world, he did have sexual relations with his mother. It's only his inner world in which he didn't have sexual relations with his mother. But if the inner world is irrelevant to criminal law, if it's a matter of what lawyers call strict liability, then he's guilty. And he was. He was treated as guilty himself. He himself treated himself as guilty, as we know. So that was a culture in which criminal law was simply strict liability. There was no inner life relevant. It's much later, first with some of Augustine's remarks, then developing through certain treatises in the time of Henry III, and then later in Edward Coke's treatises, it then emerged that you needed something like intention, mens rea, the inner life mattered, and this got even more sophisticated, and you had the claims that not only must you intend it, but even if you didn't intend it, if you knew it would cause hurt or harm, you were wrong. And sometimes it was also the cognitive dimension of inner life was even made richer. That is, even if you didn't know, but it was obvious, then you ought to have known that it would cause hurt, right? So the inner life becomes subtle and rich as criminal law detaches itself from strict liability to introducing mens rea and these subtler forms of inner life as being relevant to the assessment of crime. And it's here, I think, that there is an enormous difference between somebody like M.F. Hussain and Salman Rushdie. Because if you notice, quite apart from the law courts, if Salman Rushdie had been brought to the law courts as M.F. Hussain was, maybe the justices would also have ruled in his favor rather than against the litigants. But in our minds, in the general public's court of law, if you like, there is no doubt that almost everybody that I know, anyway, in our part of the world, that is in India and in the world where there are large Muslim populations, everybody responds differentially to M.F. Hussain and Rushdie. There's far more sympathy for Hussain than Rushdie. And we need a a way of diagnosing that. And I think the way of diagnosing it is that once you enrich the inner life, as in the assessment of law, we do feel that Rushdie knew when what he was doing was going to hurt. And there's no similar feeling that we have about Hussein. I think that makes a very big difference. I mean, there are other reasons why we favor, why we have more sympathy for Hussein than for Rushdie, partly because I think Hussein is facing the wrath of a majoritarian and an authoritarian context, whereas Rushdie is, in fact, sitting in the West and is playing into the Islamophobia around him. So there are all those reasons. But I think the crucial thing is that the inner life of criminal assessment, in criminal assessment, tends to favor M.F. Hussain over Rushdie. But the trouble is that when it comes to identity politics, when it comes to communal politics, the inner life is ruled out. And it's not ruled out in the way that it was in ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, the inner life was never introduced. In identity politics in the modern period, where we live with a criminal law based not on strict liability, but on mens rea and other forms of cognitive inner life as relevant to assessment of crime, all that is just simply subtracted because Hussain was wrong according to his Hindutva attackers, not because of anything that he intended, but simply because it was a Muslim who produced those artworks. And so in the public court of law, the fact is that in the identity politics of public life, the inner life plays no role at all. It's just what your identity is in objective terms. And I think that is really a very serious thing for the Supreme Court and others to consider now, that the law should be correcting. The law of a secular society should be correcting for the subtraction of the inner life from the assessment of crime. That is everywhere so in public life, and the law should be stepping in to correct for that tendency in public life. All right, I'm going to stop now and take questions.
Yes, right. This was indeed one of the most thoughtful and thought-provoking lectures I've ever heard on the subject of secularism and art. We were fortunate to have with us Professor Akeel Bilgrami to deliver the first interdisciplinary public lecture on Indian secularism and art. The Center for Jawaharlal Nehru Studies offers to teach research-based courses in an interdisciplinary mode. Professor Bilgrami today has truly echoed the mandate of the center by speaking on interdisciplinary issues touching upon the disciplines of history, politics, philosophy, sociology of art, and art history. The concepts and terminologies discussed today have opened before us a broad vista of discourses and debates which have a bearing on contemporary India, like nationalism, pluralism, multiculturalism, majoritarianism, and diversity. Current discourses on secularism and secularization tend to be sometimes fuzzy and without clear boundaries. Therefore, Akeel's understanding of secularism as a as a process of transformation, as a political doctrine, and secularization as a process of transformation of society is entirely relatable in the context of contemporary India. I'm thankful that Professor Bilgrami's lecture will help us to redefine and with some clarity these concepts, which are sometimes very loosely used in the public domain. His reading of colonial and post-colonial history has a depth of understanding which I'm sure has been incredible for the non-historians in the audience here today. In today's lecture, he has also illuminated our understanding of identity and belief, fearlessly touching on volatile issues of politics and art in contemporary India. Professor Bilgrami does not fail to remind us of India's long history of lived pluralist traditions and more recent history of secular nationalism, almost nudging us to believe that we need to understand our colonial past and our constitutional history in order to plan for our political future. One of the main take-home messages of this lecture, to my mind, is to bring in conversation the dilemmas of secularism in contemporary politics and art history. In the course of the lecture somewhere, we do understand the need to read Professor Bilgrami's lecture with all the subtexts underlined in the binaries like the public and the political, the religious and the secular, the sacred and the profane. His exposition on India's art history and artistic traditions should be read in the backdrop of these binaries. The touchstone of a liberal state is in the domain of citizen rights. Therefore, any assessment of contemporary Indian politics and the freedom of speech and expression lie in a fine distinction between a liberal and an illiberal state. Let me conclude by now addressing our enchanted audience here today to respond to Akeel Bilgrami's lecture through a brief interactive session whereby we can ask Professor Bilgrami to respond to some of these questions. Let me thank Professor Bilgrami once again for such a thinking and thought-provoking lecture today. Now we could move on to the question answer session, where due to the paucity of time, we may be able to take a couple of questions. I'll take them one by one, and may I ask Professor Bilgrami to respond, please. The first question that I could see in the chat box. Professor Bilgrami, are you ready? Professor Bilgrami, are you ready for the question answer session?
Yes.
Yes. The first question is from N. Ravi. How would you situate blasphemy laws, in particularly the offense of blaspheming any religion, under the Indian Penal Code in relation to secularism on the one hand and the demands of social harmony on the other? This is the first question, Professor Bilgrami. If you could take this.
Right. So the question of social harmony is not a question of principle. It's a question that you may introduce in order to say that the question of social harmony may be brought in to put aside the principle of free speech, right? To say that something is going to cause a great deal of violence, there's just going to, and you might want to say, okay, so we are not going to implement the free speech principle because of that. But it's not going to replace the free speech principle. It's going to put it aside, which is a completely different thing. So I actually remember Romila Thapar was over at my place one evening in New York, and Edward Said was there as well, and Edward Said was saying how it was appalling that Salman Rushdie had been told he cannot come to India. This was way back after in the early 90s when the Satanic Verses was in the aftermath, a year or two after its publication. And Rabindranath Tagore said, please tell him not to come. Right? It's going to be awful. There's going to be there are going to be riots everywhere, and the Muslims will be even more despised as a result of it. So please tell him not to come. And you can see that social harmony there might be considerations of social harmony to advise things of that kind, to say, well, okay, we're going to not take the risk of public violence and so on and so forth. But it can't replace the principle. It's just a reason to put the principle aside for pragmatic reasons of this kind. On the question of blasphemy, you see, I think it's a very interesting it's a very interesting question. If you take, for instance, what happened in the United Kingdom. See, in the United Kingdom, when The Last Temptation of Christ was published, there was an enormous protest by Christians. The novel has passages when Christ was supposed to have homosexual fantasies while he's on the cross and so on. Christians were offended, and Mary Whitehouse started a campaign to ban the book, and she succeeded. The book was banned. Decades later, the Satanic Verses was not banned. In fact, Salman Rushdie was defended. Millions of pounds were spent to protect him against violence, threats of violence, and so there was a differential. In that case, there was a differential application of the free speech law and the two blasphemy. And I think that's just simply British prejudice against Islam. British has a nominally established church, and all that was coming out in the differential decision over these two cases. And in India, there's a view very prevalent amongst Indian academics that there should be a neutrality between religions, and that's what secularism is. I think that's just wrong. Secularism is not neutrality between religions at all. Secularism is the lexicographical ordering that I presented, and neutrality between religions should only be understood as a side constraint on how to implement the lexicographical ordering. That is, you should implement it even-handedly, neutrally, between all religions, which was not done in the UK. And when we gave Indian Muslims that personal law, we did not implement reform of law even-handedly. So there again, but that was a temporary, it was always had a temporary clause. It was not a minority right. It was never seen as a minority right. It was a temporary putting aside of reform for reasons that were pragmatic, partly because of the losses that Indian Muslims suffered during the partition and its outcome. There's one thing that I want to actually point out while we were talking about Hussain, which I should have said. I've said why we tend to be more sympathetic to Hussain than to Rushdie. But there is no doubt that there is something which I think needs to be explored much more. And that is, see, the art and culture are so important and central because they provide a domain which is a domain of potential dissent against the state. And I have to say that I think M.F. Hussain, as we know, as everybody knows, was a relatively Sarkari, very much in the Sarkari domain. He was an artist who was quite cozy with the Sarkar, even during dark times in India. And I can't help feeling that that a much freer democratic zone was of art was created, not by people like Hussein, but much more recently by the Raqs Collective and by by the Samath exhibitions, which Vivan Sundaram in the 90s started. I can't remember, Art as Resistance or something, but early on, and then the Samath had many such exhibitions. So there are groups like this, Raqs and Samath and so on, and they're very different from Hussein. They're in a sense not artists in the orbit of the Sarkar, often working with the state, but they are carrying out, which I feel is the right way to think of art and culture, which is that it is a conceptual and cultural source of dissent against the state.
Jazz, whose question is, who creates the platform to let art come out of the shadow of religion? Is it socio-political or ideological? How do we see Indian art spaces in the light of recent rise in glorification of ideological thought? I deliberately didn't use the word Hindutva. This is the question for you.
Sorry, could you read that out again? I missed some of it.
Yes. Who creates the platform to let art come out of the shadow of religion? Is it socio-political or ideological? How do we see Indian art spaces in the light of recent rise in glorification of ideological thought? I deliberately didn't use the word Hindutva. Could you hear this, Professor Bilgrami? You could hear this? Yeah.
Well, you see, this is really the difference between the kind of thing that Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh and others were saying when they were reacting to what they call the quarantining of the sacred in the ethos, post-independent ethos. This is the difference between his and others' appeal to having a more ecumenical cultural and art practice. It was, as I said, why do we think culture is so important? There's no doubt that political economy is very central, if Marx is right. Right? There's no doubt about that. But in understanding society and understanding politics and so on. But why do we also think culture is important? And I think the answer has to be that it is a counter narrative to the narrative of state power. And once state power gets aligned with, so fully aligned with economic power, as it has been since 1990 in India, then it's against economic power too. But that's the point of culture. You see, state power and economic power are now inseparable since 1990. So when I say culture is a source, a conceptual, cognitive, and formal, informal form of resistance against the narratives of state, it's also now narratives of capital, which have been fused with the state. That's the point of culture. That's why we emphasize culture. We don't emphasize culture because we want a Sarkari culture. We emphasize culture because we want a counter narrative to the Sarkari narrative, or the narrative of capital. That's the point. That's the point of play. Things like Samath might even be sympathetic to a state. Say the state. The Samath might be sympathetic to the Bengali government when it was carrying out land reforms, when it did. Just an organization like Samath might have been very sympathetic to that, but still, that's not its point. Its point is not to be in any way a prop of the state. Even if it's sympathetic, it's not a prop of the state. It's not the point. And that's why the Raqs Collective, Sehmat, other groups of that kind, this much freer cultural zone that has emerged, zone of art that has emerged since Hussein's canonical period, I think is a very democratic development, and I think that's the point of culture. I mean, we should, there are people who want to stress political economy over culture. That's fine, political economy. You can't understand society without understanding political economy. But the point of culture is this, I think. It's not just to understand it, but to dissent from the narrative of the state, which, as I said, since 1990, includes the narrative of capital.
I wish we could go on, but due to the constraints of time, we have to declare the question answer session closed. And now I would request Dr. Etee Bahadur from the Center for Jawaharlal Nehru Studies to give the vote of thanks.
As the Jamia Millia
Bahadur to give the vote of thanks.
Yes. As the Jamia Millia Islamia centenary year comes to a close, the Center for Jawaharlal Nehru Studies, Jamia Millia Islamia, initiates the interdisciplinary lecture series in the year 2021. Let me begin by thanking Professor Najma Akhtar, Vice Chancellor Jamia Millia Islamia, for encouraging us to initiate the interdisciplinary lecture series 2021. Thank you, Vice Chancellor Madam, for agreeing to chair the first lecture of the Interdisciplinary Lecture Series 2021 on Indian Secularism and Art by Professor Akeel Bilgrami. A special word of thanks to Professor Akeel Bilgrami for agreeing to deliver the lecture at a short notice. Professor Bilgrami, this has been an extremely thought-provoking hour. I would like to thank the Director, Center for Information and Technology, Dr. S. Kazim Naqvi, Jamia Millia Islamia, for helping us reach out to a huge online audience by screening this event today. It has been a pleasure jointly working with the Director, Center for Jawaharlal Nehru Studies, Professor Rumki Basu, as I have been actively associated with the event. Thank you, ma'am, for planning, organizing, and moderating the event today. It would have been impossible to organize something like this without the wonderful office staff of CJNS. I would like to thank Mr. Wajahadullah Khan for giving us secretarial assistance. Finally, I would like to thank the audience for their interest and enthusiasm, which will encourage us to further host such events in the near future. I thank everyone once again and declare this event closed.
Thank you, Etee. I thank you, Professor Najma. Thank you, Professor Bilgrami. This was a wonderful evening, and we are very happy to have, started this series with Professor Bilgrami's lecture, which was truly an interdisciplinary one, which, was the intent of the lecture series. So, with these words, I think we declare the session closed. Etee has already declared it closed. If Professor Najma would wish to speak or say a few words at the end, ma'am, you're welcome.
I just want to thank again Professor Bilgrami for being with us today and speaking on such an interesting topic, which has kept the whole audience with you from beginning till the end. I sincerely hope that this lecture is being recorded, and with his permission, of course, but kept put on the YouTube for our students and for the world, if it is possible. And Professor Bilgrami, I would like to welcome you to Jamia campus as and when it is possible. And also like to keep a close relation between these two universities, because through people like you who can understand the problems of this country and of the world which are going on, and give us solutions and give us ideas about how to go about it. Thank you very much. Thanks for
Thank you,
being here.
Professor Bilgrami. This was a wonderful evening. And thank you, Professor Najma, for encouraging us to start the series. And Professor Bilgrami's response was wonderful. He was very prompt. And we thankfully began the series with him, because I repeat that this is meant to be an interdisciplinary series of lectures which will go on, which will move on. And what could be better than Professor Bilgrami's lecture today, which touched on history, sociology, politics, art, and so much more. Thank you, Professor Bilgrami. We'll be in touch. Thank you, Professor Najma, for gracing the occasion, for initiating the series, and for encouraging us. Thank you all. I thank the audience. Be there for the rest of our lectures. We'll move on with many more. And today we declare the session closed. Thank you all.